Rarbomb here with another 3D modeling for 3D printing tutorial. For this one, we are going to be modeling this staff from the musical version, the stage musical version of Sailor Moon. This is the Silence Glaive. I will preface this by saying I don't know anything about Sailor Moon, but I've probably done more Sailor Moon weapons and parts than probably literally any other property out there. Something I've always found quite amusing. But let's just get right into it. So I'm using Blender 2.8 Beta. My settings are under Preferences. For add-ons, I make sure that Bool Tool and Loop Tools are both selected. And my key mapping is set to 27x rather than the default internal Blender. This is just a little bit quicker to work with. A lot of the internal Blender stuff is really good for like rendering, which we're not going to worry about. Other settings I use is under the Scene tab. Under Units, I set to None rather than Metric. And finally, if you hit N, go to View. Make sure your view setting right here, just increase that to like 30,000 or something like that. This is the clipping settings under View, and this will clip the view at a certain point. And since we're going to be dealing with a very large scale, it'll clip off part of the thing we're working on. So if that happens, just increase this. You might get some weird artifacting if this is up really, really high. However, the new version of Blender, I haven't really had that issue with. All right, and we'll save. First thing to do is to delete everything that's already in here. So just hit A twice to select everything, or click and select everything by doing shift click, hit delete, delete the objects. For quick navigation stuff, if you're unaware, middle mouse button rotates. Shift middle mouse button will pan across the scene. Those are some basic navigational things. Wheel up and wheel down will zoom in and out. So you'll see me doing this a lot, and I won't be communicating these all directly. Other navigation stuff is on the numpad. The different numbers will correspond to different views. Top orthographic, front orthographic, right orthographic, left orthographic. These are just numpad 1 through 9. And I also pop between these quite a bit. So you'll see that happen quite a lot while I'm working on this. All right, let's add a reference image. That's usually the first thing and the most important. So I'm gonna add image reference. I'm gonna select my image, unselect align to view, and hit load reference image. And there it is. And it's gonna align that to top orthographic. Now this is an image that's in the scene that we can see from all angles that we're gonna use to build this model off of. We're going to switch to top view, which is 7. It's top orthographic. Now I want to rotate this so that this right here is roughly in the middle. And to rotate, I'm going to hit R and just spin it to about right there. Then move it over by hitting G to grab. And that looks pretty close right there. Last thing I'm going to do is this thing is directly on the Z axis. I'm going to move it down a little bit by hitting G and then Z, then move it down so it's a little below, just like that. All right, now we're going to figure out the scale of this weapon right here. And the way I'm going to scale is I'm going to scale it based upon this rod right here. And I'm back. A little bit of a cut there. I had to take care of some stuff. So to continue, we're going to be using a piece of PVC pipe as the main part of this rod. And a really good size that I've found is 3/4 inch PVC. So I found this image on Amazon right here of Schedule 40 PVC pipe. This is what I use for almost everything. This is kind of a generic size. The Schedule 40 essentially refers to the thickness of the pipe. And the 3/4 inch size refers to the internal diameter of the piece. And I do know the pipes can vary a little bit on the inside. They're not always exactly this. Someone out there might correct me on that, but that's from what I understand. The outside of a piece of 3/4 inch PVC is around 1 inch. And I've kind of measured out if I want to have a piece of PVC pipe that can be inserted into a 3D printed object, about 27 millimeters is a pretty good size for that pipe. Hope you're still following along with this. I know it sounds complicated, but bear with me. So in our design here, I'm going to start with a piece of a cylinder that's going to represent the 3D printed, or sorry, represent the PVC pipe that we're going to use for the main structure of the staff. So I'm going to add a cylinder. And the cylinder, make sure the radius is 13.5, because radius is half the diameter. So double that, it's 27. Vertices doesn't matter that much. 32 is just fine. And then I'm going to press R to rotate, and then X to rotate it along the X-axis. If I hold the control button, it'll snap. And I want to snap to about a 90-degree rotation, because I want it to correspond here. And let's scale it along the Z-axis, like so. And we can just scale it over here on the Z-axis. We can scale it to, I think, about 1,000 is going to be about the right size from my kind of pre-estimate. Sorry, the dimension should be 1,000. And that's about 1 meter in length. So now let's scale this up to correspond. So zoom out, hit S, and start scaling that reference image. Then press G to move it. Going to shift it along, scale it. Right about there looks good. This is just going to be, we're going to go back and adjust this a little bit here. So if I want to know exactly, if I'm kind of getting close, I could also figure out how tall this actress is. This is actually her name. I was actually looking to see if I could figure out how tall she was, so I can actually get a perfect measurement for this staff, but I was unable to find one. But I'm going to guess somewhere between 5'3" and 5'4". Maybe with the heels 5'6" or 5'7", which I believe is about 185 or 86 centimeters. So let's just kind of make a guess here and see how that looks. And maybe someone here is a big Sailor Moon fan will know exactly how tall this person is. So it's 185 centimeters. Then it's going to be 1,850 right here. So this is just I make cubes for measurements sometimes, and I'll just like create a like a mesh plane like this, and I just scaled it up, rotate it. So right now the staff's gonna be pretty small. This right here would actually be 185 centimeters, so it's gonna be about wrong. It'd be kind of wrong. So that's about how tall the actress is according to my scaling, which would be 124 centimeters. If you go to Google and just type in 124 centimeters to inches, you'll get an idea of the sizing. So it looks like I put that at about 4 feet. So I actually want this to be a little bit larger. So let's scale that up. Let's go up to about there. So about 180, that puts it at about a little under 6 foot, which is a little too big. I know this sounds a little tedious, but it pays off later when you get something that's pretty close. All right, so about 172 centimeters puts it at about 5'7". So let's actually scale that up there. And that actually looks like a good size, right about there. And you can always feel free to adjust this later, depending on how big you want something to be. And I'm just going to delete this cube. It's just a reference cube. Save it. All right, now that I have this here and I have this here, I can start actually kind of figuring out how big this whole staff's going to be. So I'm going to scale this up a little bit more, like so. Part of my thought with this staff is that this staff is not only going to be this main rod, it's also going to support all of the pieces. So it's going to, so I need to have enough of this part here that's going to print out that will then overlap over this rod here, so that this thing won't fall off and break off later on. I want this to be pretty steady. And as a cosplayer and a prop maker, it's really annoying to have a prop you make fall apart And so I'm very, very conscious of that when I make things for myself, and especially when I make things for other people. And we could probably do the same thing here. We could actually make this is actually a little smaller than this here, and there's some tricks we could do, but I'm gonna just do a version of this that'll work, hopefully. And I'll show you a little trick that I use also later on that might work for that. All right, so I'm gonna move this down a little bit, doing a box select, which is just Control B, and then just slide it down. I'm gonna want it to end right there, because I think when I print this here, I'm gonna have this whole entire thing be one piece right here. And that'll be a piece, and then I'll have a piece up here, probably one here, and so forth. And depending on the size of the printer, that's going to make a big difference. And when I print these top pieces, I print them flat on the printer. They're going to look like this. Then I'm going to print another half like this. Then I'm going to glue them together. And that's going to make them basically indestructible. It's really, really nice to have. Durability is very important. All right, let's just start with the tough part. We are going to create the actual glaive blade. We're going to add a mesh, and we're just going to add a plane. Plane's all the way down here. Press G to move it. Slide it up here somewhere. Scale it up. Maybe rotate it or something, or you can just go to Tab and go to Edit mode. We're going to grab the vertices and just rough out the basic shape of the object like so. Then go to Add Modifier, which is over here. Make sure the plane is selected. Add Modifier. If it's not there, you want to actually go down and select it. Do Subdivision Surface. Give it about 2 views. Make sure you select this Adjust Cage Edit to Modifier Result. And what that does is if I go back to Edit mode, I am now editing a very, very smooth object. It's essentially, subdivision is interpolating additional polygons inside of this polygon to simplify it. You can see them right there. It makes it a little bit more curved, and that way I don't have to make every single piece of the curve. It makes nice smooth edges. There are probably other ways to do this also, but this is just the way I prefer to do it. And all I'm doing here to add these parts is I'm just selecting the 2 vertices, which then selects the line. Then just hitting E to extrude, and then scaling it out, then hitting S to scale. And then just sort of shifting these polygons around. We're just going to kind of do a rough sizing. We're going to go back through later and adjust all this. Now go to the bottom, extrude it. Let me rotate it a little. Extrude it again. There. And feel free to make mistakes here. Feel free to go over your work again. You will have to do a lot of... luckily, I've actually designed this exact thing before. Did a little test run. And I've made multiple variations of my original version of the staff. So I kind of know what I'm doing, which is kind of helping me speed along with this really quick. It's very, very funny on Twitter or on Instagram. The things I get tagged in most are not my silly costumes like a Morton Trump or Buzz Lightyear or a Morton Joe. It is Sailor Moon staff kits and Sailor Moon weapons that I've made for people. There's like these Moony Mondays. Every Monday I get tagged in like 15 Sailor Moon posts. And I think it's great. I think it's really cool, you know. And I can see what people do with, you know, I make these like kits for people on my store that are just like I would almost call it a paint by numbers of sorts. And people take those and they make amazing things out of them. They just do awesome work from the basic building blocks that I've given them. And it's kind of awesome. It feels like in some ways, a form of collaborative art. And I can kind of feel a part of it as the designer, and they can do all the tedious sanding work that I hate doing with a passion. So actually, when I'm designing some stuff in 3D, in my 3D modeling, I'll actually try to think of ways I can minimize the amount of sanding I'm going to do later. I've even come up with some ideas about some new tricks that I might try to eliminate as much sanding as possible. And I will cut things up into a dozen individual objects just so I don't have to sand one extra piece or remove some tiny bit of support material. All right, that gives me the rough basic shape for the blade. Now let's add some depth to it. You'll notice the blade here is hitting N, then go over here to View. The blade is exactly on the Z-axis right here. So is this reference image. I'm going to move the reference image down by hitting G and then Z and drag it down a little bit. Like at about here. I don't actually need it to be anywhere close. Then I'm going to hit this up here, which is a disable selection. This makes it so I can no longer select that object. So now it's just a little floating thing back there. I'm not quite sure how to make these semi-transparent, which would also be very, very nice. So the other command I use a lot here is Z. Z will... Oops. See if I can pop this back on here. Z, which enables a like a see-through mode. It's an X-ray, and that's another thing I use all the time. All right, so the top object, we want to add some depth. And so to do that, I am going to, first of all, I want to add the middle curve of the blade right here. I'm sure there is a term for it. I just don't know what it is. So to do that, we're going to add a loop cut right there. Hit select. Now there's also going to be some loops right here. So we'll add that here, just like that. Now I'm going to select it. Am I going to edge select, then hit Alt, click, select that loop. Then I'm going to do two changes. Go back to vertex select and shift click and unselect just the ends and then just select these two. I'm just doing a shift click. So now I can manipulate those internal pieces right there. Then I'm going to hit G for grab and Z to move it up a little bit to right about there. And I want to be very conscious of one thing now. My support rod, that PVC pipe, this has to be larger than that PVC pipe because this PVC pipe is actually going to go into the inside here. I want this to actually go inside here to have a little bit of grip and a little bit of connection right there because it's got to be able to support all this weight and strength. As you move it up, I want it to be a little bit above that right there, and we'll add a little more to that later. And you'll notice it's kind of curved right now because of the subdivision modifier. And if we want to make that a more sharp edge, we're going to have to crease this top piece right here. We do that by hitting N, going to View, and under Transform Settings, which is the very, very top one here, I'm going to increase the mean crease right here to 1. That creases that edge. So you can kind of tweak it. Then we'll go through a little bit here and tweak some of this individually. Let's add a crease to this here also. See, that's kind of like those kind of like swishes right there. I want to try to replicate that as much as I can. So now I'm just moving the individual points around to kind of sort of replicate that look. So I think this wants to be maybe a little more flat right here. So one of the good things I like about Sailor Moon is that really everything I've made has been at most inspired by Sailor Moon because I'm kind of like, I take some of the things that are ideas from them and I sort of just do my own version of it. So like my Saturn Glaive, if I see it, I know it's mine because it's my own kind of piece of fan art for it, for something I have never really paid any attention to. So I want to make this curve here a little more concave. So I'm going to go to Loop Cut, add a loop right there. Go back over here to Select. That gives me another point of selection. So yeah, so I really like the fact that I can kind of do my own thing, and so I have a little bit more ownership over my idea, rather than being really strict to canon like you would kind of have to be with like a Star Wars some property or something like that. And it's the same thing with the gun I made last week for Warhammer 40K. Is like I can kind of I can do my own idea. I don't have to be restricted by exactly what they've done. And just because look at the sheer amount of people who do Sailor Moon mashup ideas. A friend of mine just proposed a really fun idea for a mashup of Sailor Moon, and I was like, oh, that's a cool idea. I'm not going to spoil it, but I think it's a cool idea. It might end up going viral. So yeah, it's something that appeals to a lot of fandoms, and I like being able to do my own thing within a project, within an art. All right, that looks pretty good. You'll notice here that it's flat still. Now I want to add some more. I got to add thickness to it. So to do that, I'm going to add modifier and add a mirror modifier like that. So right now it's mirroring along the x-axis, but let's have it mirror along the z-axis like that. One other thing I want to select is clipping. That makes it so the two edges will actually connect together and not be two separate halves. So if I go in and try to move an edge, I can't drag it up anymore. If I disable that clipping, then I can actually do that. And I do that all the time. I'll enable and disable clipping. Save it. You will note, I will note once again, I am saving constantly. And you might even want to save some backups. So add a little more depth to this. Right now it's still kind of flat. It's all like one thickness, and that's actually fine, but I want to add a little bit of extra thickness to the end here. So I'm going to select some of these right here. Press G to grab and go up a little bit. Just adding a little bit of thickness here. Using a little box select. Going to rotate these. Because I have that, you can actually see the crease in this display here. It makes it kind of easy to pick out the place where I need to do that. There's probably some easier ways to do this part, but I find it just as easy to kind of go in and manually tweak here a little bit. I've done so many different versions of my other staff that like I could probably make this thing from memory. But they've done a lot of different designs. My original version was based off of the manga art. You have to be kind of careful with this stuff because sometimes you'll make something and be like, oh, that's actually based off of some fan art, which is fine, but feels a little disrespectful to the fan artist when you do that. All right, that looks pretty good. It's gonna be kind of thick, but that makes it a lot stronger. And it also lets this rod here have a little bit of gives a place for it to be a little kind of like a place to kind of insert into for strength. And so the thickness right now, it's about 44 millimeters wide. It's about a little under 5 centimeters. That's I guess about 1.5 inches or so. Sorry, 4.5 centimeters. Yeah, it's about 1.5 inches to 2 inches. That's pretty thick. I might bring that down a little bit later on, but that's okay. Let's actually decrease that in size just a tad. One thing about 3D modeling and 3D printing that I've mentioned before, it is all in metric. So get comfortable with the metric system. America, if you're listening to this from America, we are one of 2 countries in the world, or 3 countries in the world that still uses the imperial system. It doesn't make any sense at all, but it's kind of hard to start thinking in terms of another system. But 3D modeling is a great way to get started with that. All right, there's the glaive. Looks pretty good. Now let's add a little, much happy with the curve here, so I'm going to select this here. There, that looks pretty good. I might sharpen this a little bit here in a second, but I think that looks fine right now. Now let's add this little flower piece. One difference I'm going to make is, you notice the flower piece is kind of separate from the glaive. I'm going to have it overlap a little bit more That way it's a little stronger, because I don't want there to be a little weak point here, because that would be a one big strong bump here, and it could actually break this part in half, and I do not want that. There's actually some good ways to kind of avoid that, but then you start dealing with threaded rods, and threaded rods are kind of a pain. So we're going to do the same thing. We're going to create a plane. We're going to do the same process we did before. We're going to move it up here. So I'm going to move it by using the control button, because I want it to kind of snap on the y-axis up here. You can also move it manually and scale it up. But one thing I want you to keep track of here is I want you to stay on the x-axis. I want you to keep that at 0. If you hit, just go up here and hit 0 on that, it'll align to the x-axis. That makes a big difference, because this object here is going to be the same on this side and this side as it is on the flip sides. So we could actually just model 1/4 of it and then mirror it twice. And so you really want it to be aligned with the center of the object to do that, thus being on the Z and X axes. So now that we have this plane up here, go to tab, go to edit mode, or you can go to add modifier. You can do these in either order. We're going to add a subdivision, and we're also going to add a mirror. And we're going to mirror along the X and the Z axis. Make sure the mirror comes before the subdivision. If you need to move it, click this button right here, and then enable clipping. And then the subdivision, maybe go 2 on the view, and then reselect this adjust edit cage to modifier result. That way I can select the actual pieces. Then I'm going to select the whole entire thing by hitting A. Press G to grab it, and then move it over to one side. And you'll see it does that right there. So right now, when these little dots that are almost impossible to see, when these actually end up hitting that middle Z axis, they snap into place. And that's a result of the clipping modifier. We want to make sure the clipping comes before the subdivision. Otherwise, we can get some kind of strange... Sorry, the mirror comes before the subdivision on this, because it causes some strange behavior. There are occasionally reasons to do it the other way, but this is the way I prefer to do it. So let's grab these here, and let's model this little thing right here, just like this. And we hit Z to take a look at it. So unfortunately, the way I'm doing it, I have to do it with just these outlines, because I need to be able to see my reference material. All right, so there's a little bit of a bump up here, and we'll replicate that. We'll select these two sides, hit E to extrude, like so. Go through here. Such a weird shape. When I model stuff, I start to make up nicknames for things. So I call like this the flower. I had a piece that I called the mace, and then all of like the bell, and so people will get copies of my files and just see these bizarre names that hopefully make sense to them, hopefully differentiate all the little tiny parts, but might be confusing or strange to people, especially if they're not accustomed to it. So that's pretty close to the shape. There's probably some canon explanation for this part. So when we're done, we'll actually move it up here so it overlaps, but for now, we can keep it right there. Additionally, this is going to have to be a little bit larger, but I'm not going to worry about that for now. All right, so now let's maybe I'll tweak it a little more. So I'm making this because I actually got a request for it on Etsy. I'm not sure if I mentioned that yet. I've been meaning to make a new version of this for a while because there's so many different versions. I think people might like a little bit of variety. And if everyone just ends up with the same exact staff, I don't think it's quite as interesting. Save it. All right. Now let's move it on the Z-axis. Now I can't move it right now. I've selected all the pieces, can't move it. The reason is because I have clipping enabled. So we're going to temporarily disable that. Hit G and Z, move it up. I want it to be above this right here because that has to go all the way through it. it's going to be pretty thick, but I think the trade-off of having this be stronger is worth it. Re-enable clipping. And there's two ways to like fill in these edges. We can either select this, all the edges, and hit extrude, then G and Z, and go down like that. Or you can just extrude the entire thing and then delete some of the faces, but this is the best way to kind of take care of that. And the top of this here, you'll notice is actually very flat and very sharp right here. This part here has more of a curve. This piece almost looks like a piece of cauliflower. We'll call it the cauliflower. So the base of the stem of the cauliflower, and the top is a lot more flat, so we're going to replicate that look. And we'll do that by adjusting the crease on the parts that we want to crease. So you'll note that it's selecting on the opposite sides, here and here. That's because we have a mirror on. And we'll crease it. Get a nice sharp edge like that. Then we can scale this up a little bit, or scale it down accordingly. I'm going to scale this part here. And to do that, I'm just going to select these. Actually, just going to do just the outside here. Press G and Z. Kind of drop it in a little bit. I'll even do this here. There we go. That's starting to look pretty good. Just hitting G and Z to kind of adjust this. As long as the middle has a decent thickness, to take into account the support piece. Like so. So you can actually make the support piece a little bit thinner. You could use a piece of wood. There's some like 3/4 inch wood. But wood takes a little bit more finishing, and the links aren't always as easy to find as one might want or one might expect. You can find one foot pieces of a 1 foot dowel, sorry, a 1 inch thick dowel. You can find like 3/4 inch, but if you're trying to like find 5/8, it can be a little trickier to find it in the right length that you want. But the good thing is, if I want to adjust the scaling on this, I can really easily. I can just change this, then go through and change everything later. I think that looks pretty good. So if we have this rod going in here, or this staff going in here, this is going to provide a decent amount of support, especially if it's kind of right there. It's going to provide a decent amount of support for it. Like so. We could even probably come up with something here that might work for that, or even just leave it like that. Sometimes people might want it to look that way. All right, now I want to have these little grooves show up in the cauliflower, the spaces between the stems, and we could actually model that in manually just by adding some little cuts in here. And let's try that and see how we like it. So when I do an experiment like this, especially on a piece that I've already modeled, I don't want to lose what I've already done. So I'm going to create a backup folder, essentially, of extra pieces. And before I do that, I want to go through and make sure I name all of my parts. So I'm going to select the blade and go up to, where is it on this one? Here we go. This little box, that's the object settings. And we're going to label it the blade, just like that. You can also label it up here by double clicking. The cylinder, I'm going to call it a 27mm cylinder. Empty is a RENC reference photo. You know, I failed spelling once. This is going to be the cauliflower. Cauliflower? Sure. It's dumb, but I can look at this up here and immediately know what it is. But I'm going to create a backup of the cauliflower piece. And to do that, I'm going to create a new scene collection. So my main collection here, I'm going to call this the modeled parts, but I want to have a backup. So I'm going to click up here under New Scene Collection, hit New, and call this Backup. Now, when you create a new object, it's going to insert that object into whatever scene you have selected up here, regardless of whether or not these are visible or not. So you can actually make an entire piece of here. Everything in here can become invisible with just one click, or individual pieces, however you want. You can just pop the whole entire thing off or make it unselectable. This is one of the coolest new features of the new version of Blender. And having a good, and I'm trying to use this a lot more than I have kind of in the past. So backup. And I'm just gonna create a duplicate of this cauliflower, Control D. And there's my duplicate right there. And I'm gonna move it by hitting M and move it to backup. Then I'm gonna hide it. Now, note that I still have backup selected. So if I create a new object, it's gonna insert it into here. So make sure you reselect modeled parts for these edits. All right, so this up here, so if I screw something up here, I make it the wrong thing, or I don't like what I've done, I can just delete it and go grab my reference piece, my backup piece really easily. Any part where I don't want to redo my work later, it's really useful. So we're going to try to model these little grooves in here manually, and it can be a little tricky sometimes, so that's why I'm going to kind of try to do it like I'm going to give it a shot first. Let me move this reference photo up a little bit. Right there. All right, so there's gonna be like a little heart-shaped piece right here. There's a couple ways to do it. We can use the knife, but it's not super accurate the way it is in the cuts, because the cuts are then modified by the subdivisions that you do. So it can be a little trickier. So my preferred method for this part is actually to create some objects that then slice those pieces out of here. So no matter what I do to this, they're going to kind of be replicated. That work's going to kind of be replicated down here. I'm going to do one more tweak to the size of this here while we're at it. Yeah, looks pretty good. All right, I had to do a little edit there. But so we're going to create the grooves in this object right here. To do that, we're going to go to Add Mesh Plane. I'm just going to add way down here. And we're going to move that all the way up here. And this data information is going to be replicated along the Z and X axis. So we're going to set those both to 0. Hit Tab to go into edit mode. Move this, how about right here? Like so. Then move it up. So it's kind of floating above the plane here. You go add modifier. Let's add a mirror modifier along the X and Z axis. Make sure clipping is enabled. Then add a subdivision modifier to smooth those out. Then we're going to add another modifier. We're going to add a solidify modifier. Let's set that to about 4. What that does is it gives us a 4mm thickness on our plane. So whatever we add to the plane, it just thickens it automatically for us. That saves us a lot of work. So the truth is, at this point, like the actual art I've seen for this, it's kind of hard to pick out exactly what these look like. But the middle looks like kind of like a heart. These outer ones are like points with like a little edge to it, like a little kind of twisted L or something like that. So we'll just kind of make something up and it'll be close enough. So let's create duplicates like so, one for each. Go to the middle one, move it to the center like so. Actually, don't do that. Go here. Then we're going to select one of the edges, then extrude it like so. That pops those edges together like that. And that gives us a little heart. This is another one of those places like above where we can kind of do our own bit of creative work, kind of have our own idea about how these should look. People have had criticisms of my stuff before where, not necessarily criticism, but an observation that the piece doesn't look exactly like the one from the show, but that's often because there's just there's so many different variants. But no one's ever complained about this part because it's kind of a small detail. Often when you're translating something from a concept art to a real world object, you kind of make some concessions in your design. I know I've had some cosplays where a lot of cosplays I've done are things that never existed in real life. And so I've instead had to kind of come up with a, like, what is this thing actually supposed to be? And then kind of replicate the idea of what it is, because I don't actually know what it could actually potentially look like. Let's add a little curve to this right here. And maybe I can probably look up some more art later on for this part and come back to it to kind of give me an idea about what these should look like. But I think that looks pretty good. When you're doing magical girl stuff, adding some more hearts, no one's ever going to complain about that. So now we want these to kind of groove into here. And the reason why we do that is because I'm going to use this to cut these are going to be cutting out of this right here, like cookie cutters. So we can select them individually. And so we're going to do a linked select. You can either do a plane, an edge, or a vertices, doesn't matter. Hit Control L, and that selects everything connected to it. I'm going to move it down like so. I'm going to rotate it a little bit along the y-axis, kind of like that. You kind of get an idea about what I'm doing here. Like so. Take this one over here and do the same thing. Move it down. Make sure that the planes you're cutting, the top of it is floating above the object, not below. There are some shrink wrap modifiers you can do to do this stuff automatically. So if you're doing a lot of engraving, sometimes that's not a bad idea to kind of have a shrink wrapping, but that can cause some clunkiness as well. And I'll worry about that for another video. All right, so those are the curves that I want to do. Now, the cutting that we're going to use, if you go to Edit Preferences, I mentioned that add-on Bool tool, which is right here. And that's the tool we're going to be using right here. And that hotkey is Control-Shift-B. It's also something like kind of Control-Alt+- will do the actual cuts. And make sure you select Use Wire instead of Bound Box for the visualization, and I will show you what that looks like in a second. Hit Save Preferences if you haven't already. Now we're going to select the object that we are going to make the cuts with, then select the object that we're going to do the cutting to. We're going to hit Control, then plus. So that adds it, or you can do Control- to cut. You can also change that operation to an intersect, the union, the difference, whatever you want it to be at that point. It is up to you. And there we have some nice little curves and cuts. Now these two objects are kind of related, but if we move the top one, it doesn't move. So if we want, I'm going to apply the scale really quick. Control, apply the scale. If I want to, I can link these two objects. If I move this, it'll also move this. And that's actually pretty easy to do. I think they changed it so you can just... No. So select the object you want to parent. Select the other one. I think it's Control-P. Set parent to object. That way if I move the parent, it moves the rest of it as well, which also counts for scaling and rotating. Pretty cool, huh? And you'll see up here, if we go into this up here, I think might be under modifiers or plane. Somewhere selected in here if you want to see the parent. Let's find the actual thing I want to do. Say this is a new version of Blender. Still getting used to some of the functionality. But yeah, one of the settings in here is for parenting. So you can actually just type in a part. It's not required. It's just kind of a nice little quality of life thing. If you want to move things around. I don't know where it's at. It's in there somewhere. And so yeah, that's all now all one big piece. It's nice and simple, and we can go back through and tweak this, add more detail, remove some detail if we want. I think this should be a little more curved down here. So I'm going to extrude it like so. I think that looks pretty good like that. I'm just kind of, I have the, it's not a bad idea if you have a second monitor. If you're doing a lot of 3D modeling, especially for 3D printing, a second monitor is really, really helpful. So I often will have the reference image up on my other screen as well, in addition to other reference material. You can also print it out. Add a crease to that. Move it to there. Yeah, there we go. That's adding a little bit more of that there. And let's select this edge here and crease that. All right, I want to flatten this edge out in the bottom. Let's do that. I'm going to select this here, hit scale along the y-axis, and just click it. And you'll see it right here. This resize thing will pop up. Change the y-axis scale to 0. What that does is it flattens out that along the z-axis. You can kind of scale it to right about, that looks about right. A lot of 3D modeling is, and a lot of art, and 3D printing is no exception. Sometimes you're trying to find your art in the thing you're making. You're trying to carve out the pieces, kind of trying to explore what you're making. You make a lot of tweaks along the, and you make a lot of tweaks and adjustments along the way. Sometimes I'll go through and throw out an entire idea and reset it back to some earlier idea. Okay, looks pretty good. Let's add a little bevel on this maybe. That might look kind of good. There's a couple ways to add bevels. We'll use the bevel modifier. Add modifier bevel. Now I want the bevel to only be on the weight limit. And what that is under here, under edge data, mean bevel weight. So it's only going to bevel what we tell it to bevel. And so I want it to be the same as right here. Turn the bevel weight up to 100. Then here we can actually apply it. It should carve. All right. This should be working. There we go. So bevel modifier is pretty cool. It's a little temperamental when using cuts. You have to kind of apply the bevels before any kind of like Boolean cuts or anything like that. It's just a little clunky otherwise. And it's giving me a weight limit on this. I don't know why, but that's okay. Gives us a little bit of a curve. We could have done this manually as well. Doesn't matter. Do the same thing here. Bevel that a little bit. And this would actually be something that would be very, very simple to do afterwards. You could just sand this down after you're done making it. Wouldn't be that tricky to do. All right, now I want to unselect these. Like, if I want to, I don't want to see these cuts. I can actually go up here and just click this to unselect them. Then I don't see them anymore. That's kind of nice to be able to do. I also want to make sure I label it. There. That way I know what I'm looking at when I'm staring up here. And we'll go through and tweak this a little more just a bit. Let's add these other staff parts. And these are the easy ones. Add a mesh, a cylinder. Let's make it about 16. Move it up here. Rotate it. Press tab and then sort of scale it up to about there. If I want to, add some loop cuts. Scale those up with S. It's a nice little piece. And the thing I want to remember is that these parts are going to be essentially inserted. this cylinder is going to go through all these right here. So these are going to act like rings around the cylinder to add more detail to it. So it's important these are the ends here to be a little bit bigger. And you want to make sure that this here has enough size to kind of, you don't want it to be too close because it's not going to look good. You don't want to be too big, it'll look kind of flat. That's about right. You might adjust this a little bit later depending on what you're more comfortable with. And just duplicate that. Make another one, just doing some quick scaling. Or go into edit mode and scale it up. Or move just the top. Just doing a little box. Select GY. Duplicate it. This is the part where I'm going quicker. I apologize. I don't want this video to be too long. This is the super easy part of this whole entire thing. And if we want to, we can make these all the exact same piece, but I kind of prefer to have individual rings. It's a lot quicker to print. There's a problem, it's easier to fix. And people like building stuff, I've kind of found. So there's a little bit of a concession here, and you might note right here. So these rings right here, the inside parts, are actually smaller than the actual rod right here. Like that here, it's a little bit smaller than this right here. And this is probably all one big, huge, solid piece. The whole thing is probably one big, solid piece. I imagine that there's like a rod goes through here that threads into something here and it kind of screws into place. And that's kind of a mechanism that's going to be a little tricky to model and tricky to design. So we're kind of doing our own version of it. As I say, a lot of this is designing our own version of these parts. Now I want to smooth it out a little bit. Add a subdivision. And I want to make sure that these outer edges have a crease on them. Probably could have done this before I duplicated it all, but that's okay. We'll just do it all manually. What goes great on 3D modeling, 3D work videos is menial grunt work, like selecting edges and applying creases. I will talk about one thing about subdivisions is I think sometimes people have an instinct to apply a lot of subdivisions. Because you may think, oh, I want this to be super smooth, so I'll apply 50 subdivisions. Well, on a 3D printer, you know, depending on the resolution of your printer, if you're working with something like a resin printer, it'll even pick up these little bumps right here, these little edges. But for the most part, most printers are going to look about here. And then when you sand it, you're going to sand all that off anyway. And the only thing a more complex image does is makes it so the files you export are larger. It makes some of the cuts to be a little bit trickier that you're going to be making. And it also makes the file sizes larger. All right, there we go. Now let's add these kind of curve in a little bit here and have little bumps. Let's replicate that a little bit. And the way I'll do that is going into my object, kind of moving it down a little bit. I'm going to select that top plane right there. I'm going to extrude it like that. So I have a nice little curve. I'm just going to do that with all of these. Or it's a cool new feature in the new Blender. You can edit multiple objects at once, which is really cool. Couldn't do this before. That's going to add a little bit of interesting visual detail. And again, with all this parts here, I'm probably going to have to go through and do some manual work on it afterwards to see if it kind of lines up the way I want it to line up. I might want these to be a little bit more dramatic than they are. I could probably even scale it down a little bit like that, so it's a little bit more of a groove. But I think flat looks pretty good. If I want to fatten it up, I can just scale it. I can either select the planes, scale it up, add a little variety to the parts. I think it looks pretty good. And I notice this curves up a little bit more right here. This is a bit of a more dramatic curve than right here. So to do that, I'm going to scale this internal piece here. If I want to, I can crease it. I don't have to go all the way. I can just go a little bit. Add a slight crease to it. Or add a couple loops. Select both of them and scale them down a little. So it's a slightly more interesting shape, maybe. Again, I don't think it really matters. This doesn't really matter a ton. I just don't want to get too large. This piece is already kind of large. I mean, this is going to be a full inch right here. So once you go beyond a certain size, it starts to get kind of bulky. All right, I think that looks pretty good. So I will say, like right here, another option I thought about doing was making these parts a lot smaller, and using a threaded rod, which is a metal rod that would go through this entire thing, rather than using the PVC pipe that goes through it. I love threaded rods. I use 5/16 inch threaded rods, and if you add about an 8mm hole to, say, all of these parts right here, you can then thread the rod onto the entire thing and screw it on like a like you're winding a nut onto a bolt, and they'll all hold on pretty well. But it also adds a lot of complexity, and the rods are not easy to cut. You need a strong hacksaw and a lot of elbow grease to cut through them because they are solid steel. And it's a little tricky to do. I might end up even doing that for the bottom tip here. Might make a couple of variants of it. But I'm not going to worry about that right now. It's probably more complexity than anyone who's listening to this cares about. But if you want to make this part thinner, that's an option. Another option is actually use a thinner piece of PVC. You can go down to 1/2 inch Schedule 40 PVC. I think a Schedule 40 PVC, you want something very hefty. But with something that's this long, with this heavy of a top, this will droop a little bit. You're going to get a little bit of drooping, which doesn't look that great. But you know, it depends on what you want to work with. All right, I'll make the bottom here. So I'm going to work under the assumption that I want this bottom piece to be pretty tough, so it's going to be a little bit larger than what's built in here. So I'm going to scale this part here out to, how about that? And I'm going to add a mesh. We're going to add a cylinder. So we're going to add the cylinder is going to be added here. And I know from a second piece of reference art that there are 6 blades on this. And so I want to replicate that 6. And so there's going to be 6 blades and then 6 spots without blades. So that means we need at least 12 vertices. So change the vertices to 12. It'll make a little more sense in a second here. I'm going to hit G, move this down right here. Let me scale it up a little bit, rotate it. Using a control left mouse button rotate. That's the snapping rotate. You can also just say 90 degrees right here. Box select. We're going to select the entire thing. And this is actually going to be a lot simpler than my previous version of this, which is going to be really, really cool. All right, I'm going to scale this down to about here. There's a cool thing. I can actually adjust the scaling so it only affects one side. Oops. Let me do this correctly. Yes, the scaling, I can scale it down like this and make it so like that, so it's only scaling along the y-axis or just the y and the z-axis, however I want. But I want it to just be along the x-axis and the z-axis, which is this way. and leave the y-axis the same. That keeps the height the same. That's just a little trick for you. Now let's select every other vertices, like so. There we go. That's why I said to have 12, because I want there to be 12 here. Now we're going to do a Alt-E, sorry, Alt-Control. There we go, Control-I, which is going to add some, one more time. We'll do it this way. We'll go to Face, Insert Faces. Oh, it's just I now. I guess that was different. Insert Faces. That's going to insert an individual face on each one of these planes right here. And this is a really cool bit of functionality. So let's scale it down just a little bit, like that. Or another option is just to hit Insert Face, hit click, and then go to thickness or depth. Is depth what I want? Yeah, there we go. Increase the depth. You can go to 10. Let's go to 1 for now. Or let's go 2. 2 for now. Sorry if that was confusing. Kept going with 800 different ways to do these things. So yeah, I selected the edges, went to Face, Insert Faces, and then selected a depth of 2. And that's going to make a 2 thickness depth right there. Now we have this 2 millimeter square. I want to be able to scale all these up so that they are about the same size. So I'm going to do it in a very tricky way. There's not a perfect way to do this, but this works pretty well for me. You're going to select the edges. Select the edges right here on all the edges, so that when you scale, they'll all scale up at the same size. And we're going to scale it to about 4 folds. Hit S to scale. Maybe 3. Let's see. That looks good. Let's do about 2.5. Or let's do about 2.5. Make it nice and even. Just like that. Now, notice how this got a lot wider right here. I don't want it to do that. So there's a trick to kind of like undo the wideness of this right here. If you go to Pivot Point Individual Origins, that's this little thing right here. Then hit Scale. I can now edit these individual pieces. And so I want to scale it down by about the same amount, 0.25. Let me do some quick math here. So I think 1 divided by 0.2, sorry, 2.5, 0.4. That's, I think, what my scaling should be at. There we go. So that here should now be about the same size as this right here. Hopefully that math made sense. I'm kind of a math nerd, so that might have been a little over people's head. Hopefully not. And we actually scale the bottom half of these too, which is kind of cool. So I think it gets thicker on the bottom here also. So go back to Pivot Point Bounding Box Center. Scale that up to about here. About a little bit of a curve to that. So I think that's pretty accurate. It's kind of hard to tell from the very small images exactly what's going on there, but I think that's pretty close. Let's save it. I'm going to apply the scale using Control A, apply this scale, and I'm going to apply the rotation just for fun. All right. There's also these little grooves right here. I think that's just the lighting. Ignore that. All right, I think that's actually pretty much all there is to that part. It's actually pretty simplistic. I'm trying to figure out if these things should curve up a little bit like this, or if they're supposed to remain totally flat. Let's curve it up a little bit. It'll look more interesting. So let's just select all of these planes right here. Sorry, these edges. Like so. Then hit G along the y-axis, which is just GY. Move it up just a little, maybe there. There we go. That looks a little more interesting. Just like that. It's kind of blocky, so let's add a little more curvature to it. Let's add loop cuts along each one of these internal edges. It'll make a little more sense in a second. Then go back and select all those internal edges. Like so. We're going to scale them up a little bit right there. Then I only want to have the scaling be on the X and Y axis, so we set the Y scaling to 1. That gives us a little bit of a curvature to that internal part right there. And if we want, we can also add a subdivision to this. But if we do, we're going to have to go through and crease all these sharp edges again. And I don't know if that's really strictly necessary. I think this is fine. This little piece here would be very, very easy to sand down. So we'll just do it that way. Let's see how this looks with a bevel. That's why I applied the scaling. I think that looks kind of cool with a bevel. What do you think? Looks a little more professional. Looks a little sharper. It's about a 0.75 bevel. There, that looks good. Well, see, a lot of this beveling you can do with a file after the piece is printed. You don't have to do it right here. And let's do the point now. Let's go add mesh cylinder for the 8 billionth time. Let's make sure the location is at 0 and 0. Sorry, I moved the 3D cursor while I was offline here. Rotate it down. Make it a little bigger. This is one of those pieces where I have to kind of do some guessing about how big I want this part to be. Probably about the same as the part above. I could probably actually have this here be most of that. And have just this little loop here be a part I glue on. That'd probably be just fine. We'll subdivide it, crease it. Then I can loop cut it. Maybe 2 loops. Scale those loops up a little. A nice little curved piece. I can probably just glue that right where it is. Alternatively, I can extrude it like so. If I do that, I want to scale this down a little. As I'm making this, there's a dozen different ways you can do this exact same thing. It's totally up to you. Now, some of this stuff might look fine when you're 3D modeling it, but when you actually get to the point where you're printing it out and you might realize this wall is too thin, that can be a problem. You don't want to, I'd recommend for structural stuff, keep everything about at least 2 millimeters in size. A 2 millimeter wall is pretty good. Anything smaller than that's a little too small. So if I create this little 2 millimeter cube, that's kind of hard to see. This is a 2 millimeter cube right here. And so I'd probably recommend keeping these edges to be, you know, roughly in line with that. I wouldn't go too much smaller. Because you want this thing to have some structural strength to it. Oh, sorry. Here we go. There we go. All right, I think I kind of messed this up a little. I think there's supposed to be a little bit of a loop right there. So let's do that. I've worked with rougher support material or rougher reference material than this, where you're not even quite sure what you're looking at. You're just kind of guessing at it because it's so tiny. Especially like a lot of older stuff is like that. You can barely tell what's happening with things. There, I think it looks pretty good like that. All right, now let's make a point out of this. So the biggest thing I know is that when I print this part here, again, we're talking about printing orientation. When you're printing something along the z-axis, that's going to give you the best resolution. So curved objects look really good along the z-axis. Along the x and the y-axis, curves don't look as good. You get kind of a staircasey effect. Sometimes with some stuff, like a curve going this way will end up kind of being staircasey like this. Whereas on the z-axis, a curve will be nice and smooth because that's the way your printer is printing those pieces. These like nice smooth curves. Whereas these are kind of like 1 layer, 2 layer, 3 layer. So there's a couple different ways to approach this. You want to think a little bit about the structural strength a little bit as you're modeling the part. So right now we'll just go ahead and model this. We'll extrude it out to here. Maybe scale it down a little bit, extrude it, make a little point. There we go. There's our point. I'll show you a strength trick now. So you have a nice little base point. I want to think about this here, how it's going to fit. Right about there. It's pretty decent. This is getting to about 200 millimeters. So now I'm thinking about the printer. Most people's printers are about 200 millimeters. So I don't want to get too much larger than this. So I'm going to do I could do a couple tricks. I could have this have a, like a little piece here that comes out that would go inside of the PVC pipe in here. That could actually be a pretty good way to support this piece. Or I could have it use a threaded rod. That's what I use for my kits. There's actually a metal threaded rod through the base piece here. Makes it a lot stronger. Keep in mind, when you're walking around a convention, this point is the thing that's going to be hitting the bottom of the floor of the convention the most. So if you give it a lot of pressure and you've printed it this way, so the layer lines would be like this, that's going to break very quickly and very, very easily because there's just nothing supporting it. Because it needs to be a little bit smaller than this here, that's going to be a problem. So let's do it both ways. I'll do it 2 different ways. I'll do a simple way and a hard way. A simple way is to have the entire thing be a point like that. So it prints out like so. It's a little bit larger than what the the default piece would be, but I don't think that's going to be too much of an issue for most people. But I would change the way this prints a little bit. I'd print it, instead of printing like this, I would print it like this. When you're printing it this way, you're printing, the z-axis printing would be along this. So these layers will lay down like so. And these are like grains of wood. This is very, very strong. However, this would necessitate us to cut this in half along the middle, print the bottom half, the top half, and then glue them together. Because I mentioned when you're printing a curve along the z-axis like so, it's going to get you a little bit of a staircasey effect. So this part's not going to be as smooth as something printed this way would be. I hope you're following along with this. This would probably be preferable. This is going to give you a very strong print, and it would probably hold up pretty well at convention, especially if you up the infill on it. The good part is you could probably just swap this piece out if it breaks. Bring extras. Breaks, just pop a new one on there because it's completely detachable. All right, here we are at the final part. We're going to be slicing this up for 3D printing. Now, this is probably a lot more complicated a slicing process than you might think, because you have a few issues right away. First of all, you need to be able to have all these pieces have to have enough material that's printed overlapping this rod or this PVC pipe to give some grip. This needs to grip onto this, and this little bit here is sure as hell not enough to give it a good solid connection. It's going to need to at least be down to here, which, as I said earlier, this is why this whole entire piece is going to be one big solid segment. I also want to think about how big of a printer I have, and my printer is going to be about I make the assumption that most people have a printer that's about 200 by 200 by 200. That's what I kind of target things for. So as I slice this up, that's how I'm going to slice it up. If I make a kit for people, I use a larger TAS5 printer, which uses about 250 by 250, which gives me a little more leeway. But I'm going to assume you have a smaller printer. And if you're one of those people who has like a huge printer, you can sometimes print pieces in one big go. But let's just get started here. So I'm going to hide the reference photo. I don't need it anymore. And let's move this piece here up to here. And as I said, I want these parts to overlap just a little bit. Nothing too crazy. I want them just to have a little overlap. It's one connected piece. It's going to be just significantly stronger like that. Let's maybe minimize that little. How about that? There we go. I think that's a good, that'll be a good solid connection. Good solid bit of material. All right, so now we have all the modeled pieces. Now we actually want to cut them apart. And the way I sort of do that is I want to assemble the different pieces first. And for the most part, I think I can print all these out in 2 or 3 pieces. I think this could be 2 parts. This is going to be 2 parts. All of these are going to be simple little parts. And then this here is going to be one, quote, large piece. And let's just go with the hard part first, which is the very top. Really quick, let's go to shading. If you go to Studio, let's go to Random. This actually shows me all the different individual pieces. That's kind of fun. Now I'm going to duplicate this cylinder right here. I'm going to call this one 27 millimeter cut. And that's going to be the actual cut. I'm going to use this to actually cut all of the different parts out. So keep that in mind. All right, so let's assume, let's add these parts together. I'm going to make this part here part of this right here. I'm going to do that using that bool tool. I'm going to select this and select this and then do Control plus. There we go. Now it's all one big huge piece. Some overlap here, so I want to get rid of a little bit of it. So let's select the edited piece. I'm going to move it to a new collection called Cuts. Right there. And make it invisible. Do the same with this. That way I'm only seeing what I'm seeing. I also like to go through here and kind of zoom in here on the X-ray and make sure there's nothing really funky or weird going on. That happens a little sometimes. It's kind of obnoxious. Looks good. Now we got to slice this thing into little pieces. All right. Start off, I want to add a little more curvature to this. Luckily, since we're using modifiers, it's very, very easy just to add another layer on the view. Smooths it out a little bit. Let's add a object. We're going to add a cube. Now, this cube is going to be the size of my printer. And let's assume it's going to be 200 by 200 by 200. That's how big my printer is. That's my maximum printer size. If I go above this, I have problems printing. So wherever I move this to, those are my limitations. So I already know, roughly, where my cuts are going to end up having to be in my object. That's about how I'm going to actually have to cut it up. Now I can go through manually and draw lines and cut pieces apart, or I can use that Boolean function to create these objects. That's actually very, very easy to do. The other thing I want to keep in mind is how I'm going to assemble these parts afterwards. Now, to print these pieces with a decent amount of support or a decent amount of strength, I want to print these parts flat. You know, think like 3D printing is like grains of wood. You want the grains of wood to go down the length of the board. That's going to give you the most strength. And it's the same thing with 3D printing. I want the grains of my print to go like this. That's going to make the strength on this, like right here, very, very strong. If they're like this, that would happen if I was printing along this way. That's going to break very, very easily. And I do not want that. So that means I'm going to have to print these parts flat and then sandwich them together. So it's going to be a top half and a bottom half. So let's get cutting. I can probably create it this way. So because there's a top half and a bottom half, I want this cube to be on, like, kind of right on the edge right here. Maybe a little over the edge. Kind of zoom in a little bit. You don't want it to be exactly on that z-axis, be a little bit off. It's a little quirk. You don't want to have too much overlap right there. And I know where the blade is, so I'm actually just going to use the bool function right here. Select my object, add modifier, Boolean, intersect, blade. There we go. If I rotate accordingly, I can see how big something's going to be. Hit tab, I can actually see it in here. There's the first part of the blade. You can kind of see how the different pieces are going to slice apart. That's the way that we're going to do it. And you notice they're only on one half. Go on the bottom half. So we're going to do one half first, and then the other half after that. Hopefully you're still following along with this. This is the part that gets really complicated. This is the part that hangs up people a lot. But this is a good process that I've figured out and I've learned how to use. So I'd recommend this to people for doing a blade like this. Normally, I would actually just have these be two separate halves and then run a threaded rod through it. But because this is a curve, we're not going to be able to do that. We have to use the, what I will flatly call the wood grain method. So we'll just do that. So there's that top piece. And let's move this to a new collection. We're going to call these blade cuts. Why not? And there they are. That's the first one. Now, this is 200 this way, 200 millimeters this way. Going this way is a little bit bigger. It's, you know, the square root of 200 squared plus 200 squared, which I guess is, I don't know, 240 or something. I can rotate it. Doesn't have to be exact. That's about the right size. That's a nice curve. Should print pretty easily. Now I want this exact same edge down here. So I'm going to duplicate this here, move it down, but make sure you're getting, these are actually lining up perfectly on the edge. Notice that now this new plane, this new piece here is overlapping with this right here. So you're going to have to actually go through and kind of trim that part out. And that's very, very easy to, it's simple to do. And we'll fix that in just a second. Duplicate it again. Go down to here. Like so. Now, one thing I do know right off the bat is that I want this bottom piece to be kind of all by itself. So I don't want to have to deal with cutting that up. So we're actually going to scale it according to the way this piece here. I want this half to be right about there. There we go. I think that looks good. That's a good chunk. We'll adjust this down. Really gotta make sure these line up, otherwise you're gonna have some issues down the road. Don't be too afraid if you have to make additional cuts. It's just extra filler. It's kind of annoying, but there we go. It's very annoying. This blade tip's just a little bit too big. Just a little too big to make this cut up into 3. So I'm going to cheat a little bit. I'm just going to pop back into my original file. I'm just going to shrink it down just a little bit. So it's nice and simple. You know, I make a lot of concessions when I'm modeling my stuff, and I don't have any problem with that. If I click on my pieces here, I can see they're all going to be at a pretty decent size. The dimensions aren't going to be too crazy, because I know this piece will fit in this little square nice and simply. Now I want to get rid of this piece right here, so I'll just go into this right here. I'm just going to select these vertices, kind of move them in like so, add a loop cut there. Kind of move those in. There we go. Because I adjusted down here a little bit, I want to make sure that I didn't... This overlap is okay. Alright, so I'm going to make the model parts invisible so I can just see these pieces here. So sometimes you'll go through here, you'll do this process and realize you made a mistake and have to redo it again. There we go. That should fit on a printer. Okay, I think it's a little too big. Let's make it just a touch smaller. Now is the boring part where I just talk to myself. Kind of hilariously, I will occasionally just talk to myself while I'm 3D modeling. So adding a microphone's actually kind of nice. Oops. So I added an object, but it appeared up here in my modeled parts rather than my blade cuts. So I had to reselect that and make sure I'm selecting this. So this is another reference piece to kind of, you know, make sure that the individual parts are going to fit on the printer. Keep in mind you can rotate stuff. So as long as it's within that rotation, those individual parts will fit and you're going to be okay. So if you're something kind of thin like this, you can rotate it like so. Rotate this to about... There, that'll actually work. Yeah, those cuts will work. And I'm going to add one more cut for this little piece over here. So let's duplicate this down here. Overlap it here. And we're going to do the same thing. Just going to add some loop cuts. You can actually add a lot of these. It doesn't really matter. These are just kind of basic cuts. Do that main object. There we go. That's like the that's the whale tail of the piece, so to say. All right, that actually looks pretty good. That's half of the blade. Now, I want these to sandwich together, but I don't want these parts to have to be glued this to this. That makes this part here easy to break. There's two ways to get around that. One is with a threaded rod between each of these. That's the way I do it normally. It's a little, you know, 10 centimeter rod in each part, and you would basically then glue them together. I think that's kind of a pain, so I'm going to do a different method with this. I'm going to do a sandwich method. Everybody loves sandwiches. So we'll start off by duplicating this bottom cube, Control D, move it down, like so. Zoom in really close, so it's about like there. There we go. So while that's about there, I will then move it, one half of it, say, like, how about there? Just like that. So I'm gonna make a little tweak. I'm gonna make a tweak to this top piece. Add a cut this way and a cut this way. And I'm gonna do this. So one side's a little taller than the other. I'm gonna make it a little easier to print on really tight print spaces. Now let's edit the bottom half here on that side. I've got a feeling, as I say, I've kind of mentioned, that if any part of this process is going to completely lose people, it is going to be this part, unfortunately. But that is okay. How about there? All right, so in making my object like this, when I glue the halves together, there's a little bit of an overlap. So I have my space for the glue. It's going to be all of this here. It's all going to be glue space, and all of this here. And those together are going to make a really strong bond between the parts, and make it hopefully a much tougher 3D modeling, much tougher prop. Because I don't like stuff when it breaks. All right, now let's duplicate this again. Go up to here. So much of this process now is just very, very basic cuts, slices. Moving little parts around so they all sort of fit together. Those two middle pieces actually line up perfectly, so we'll just leave it like that. Don't have to actually. All right, it's getting kind of messy over there. So the more surface area you can give this, the better. By using, and also you want to do as few cuts as you possibly can, if possible, just to, oops, because every single one of these cuts you're going to have to go back through later and clean up the 3D model a little bit. yeah, each one of these is going to require filler and sanding to every single one of these creases. So if you don't go through and correct them perfectly, this is where you're going to see, this is where your seams are going to show. This is where you're going to see mistakes and glitches. The final piece. I've seen swords people have made, and you can kind of tell they just didn't have the time sometimes to make these connecting pieces look as good as they probably wanted to, just because they likely just ran out of time while working on the project. So that looks pretty good. I think those parts will all be pretty stable. I'm going to make this here a little bit bigger. It's about there. Oops, I grabbed the wrong side. It's actually kind of the cool part. You can actually, should probably just done it that way. I can select both planes at the same time and edit them all at once. There we go. It's not too bad. It's pretty good. So we have 4 pieces on top and 4 pieces on bottom. That should be a pretty good set of parts. And that'll lead to a pretty durable kit. You could also do an edit to this and make this part actually connect to this right here. Like right there. It probably wouldn't look, that probably wouldn't be that bad actually. But yeah, there's the blade. So these parts should sandwich together, should secure together pretty well. You shouldn't have any major durability issues with it. It's just a heck of a lot of sanding to get this to line up. And if you have a much bigger printer, you have much fewer slices. Make a heck of a difference in the long term. All right, now let's pop back to my modeled parts over here. I'm just making them visible again. 27mm cut. Let's move that to the cuts folder. So they're right in here. Unselect the modeled parts. Selecting the 27mm cut. Now this is going to have to cut into all of these finished objects. This is actually going to be the hole that the PVC pipe is going to be inserted into. You want it to kind of go through here as far as it can. You don't want it to poke out through the other side. Oh wait, I don't know why it's moved. Oh, it's my mistake, sorry. You want to go as far through here without it poking through. Give as much surface area as possible. And that's probably pretty good right about there. So my blade cuts. We're going to select this top one first. We're going to add a Boolean. We're going to do a difference cut. And the object is going to be the 27mm cut. And there it goes. It's going to slice a hole right in there. And we're going to do the exact same thing with the bottom. Add modifier, Boolean, difference, 27mm cut. There we go. Those top parts are going to print out. And that's just going to slide right in there and lock into place pretty well. Some epoxy, some glue. That'll be super steady. If you end up having some stability issues, you can make this part longer. Or add more glue. Or even add an additional tube to the inside right here that would print out. That would actually insert into the hole of the PVC pipe. That could add a little more durability, but this should be pretty good. This should be just fine. And if it's not, I will probably find out later on. All right, now let's do the same thing for all of these right here. Add modifier, Boolean, difference, cut, Boolean, difference, cut, Boolean, difference, cut. This is adding a hole through all these. Boolean, difference, cut. Super exciting, I know. This is the riveting part of the project. The tedious and slow chopping and cutting, tearing everything apart. All right, now this is going to be, since this is a little bit bigger than 200 millimeters, if you want, you could just scale it down, this part down to, where is it, to like 200 millimeters and call it good. That's perfectly acceptable. You make it a little bit smaller, no one's going to notice or care. But if it's a little bit too big for your printer, we can cut this in half very easily. We'll label this part first. We'll call this, where are we? It's called cylinder.005, but we'll call it the glaive bottom, I don't know, fin piece. Great name, Thomas. We'll call this part here glaive. What do we call that? We'll call this the point fin piece. FN218, that might work. So that way when we cut this in half, we have something a little bit more, a little easier to work with. Can't remember if I created a cube or not. We'll create another one. Or we can just use this. Duplicate this right here. Again, this is the 200 by 200 by 200. This is how big my object is. That's about how big my printer is. Make sure all the rotations are set to 0. So the printer wants a nice big flat surface to print on. That's where it's the most happy. There's no good place in here that minimizes support material, so that doesn't matter. So we'll call this box, we'll have it be a modifier, Boolean, a intersection of that fin piece. And there it is. Duplicate that. Move it down so that these pieces, this is that piece right there, and that's the bottom of that fin piece. We'll move these to blade cuts. We'll just have that be our cut. Well, so there we are, top and bottom. So for the arrangements, I'm going to create a new scene. I'm going to call this ready for print, and I'm going to go through here and grab all of these pieces, duplicate them, move them to ready for print, duplicate this one, then I'm going to move that to ready for print, then grab all of these top pieces and do the same thing there. Actually, I'm going to do one more thing before I get too far into the ready for print thing. I'm going to add some small pegs into this so you can actually line up the parts a little easier. This is a completely optional part, but essentially you're gonna add, I'll use finishing nails, like just like little cheap nails. They're like 1.5 millimeters, 2 mil like thick, and then just create small holes in here, and then you can put the nails in there, and that'll help you line the parts up really well, and it helps give a little bit of grip to the pieces. And it makes it so the two halves won't slide very much. That's one easy way to do it. Another way to do it is you can actually, if you want these parts that line up a little bit, create a cube. Where'd that cube go? Oh. And make sure to add the cube to the sliced parts. Add a cube, move it over. So you can make a little thing like this, which would just be a little piece of plastic that would go in between here, a little hole. And what this would do is you'd have a hole in here about the same size, and then print out a little piece of plastic right here that would then help you kind of line the parts up pretty well. And that's an option as well. I may include that in a later video and make it be a little simpler. But for now, let's just add a couple little support holes pretty simply. can make them as big as you want. Typically about, I think 2 millimeters, probably about right. If that becomes too large, you can adjust this. I'd recommend printing a little test piece out to see how this works before you go too crazy with it. And yeah, just line them up. And apply the scale. So basically anywhere there's a cut, just add a couple like that. Make sure these don't go beyond the top. So if you adjust the thickness of your final piece, you want to be careful not to, like right there, you want to be kind of careful not to have the hole go all the way through. So I'll scale that down a little bit. As again, this is an optional step, but I use it for my existing kits that I sell, and it just really helps when I like clamp everything together to help line up the pieces a little bit. Again, I want to come up with some kind of 3D printing solution eventually. For this, I don't have to worry about it. You don't have to be arranged like that. You can kind of do it like this also, which might be a little easier to kind of follow along with the kind of spine a little bit. And these are just to make sure, just so the top and bottom pieces can line up a little easier. Just gives it a little extra grip. I'm going to arrange them all like this. I think that'll be fine. These don't have to be that symmetrical. It really doesn't matter because, yeah. And if you have too many in there, it doesn't actually affect your print time that much. Like these things are, if you're making a project already, sometimes you can just kind of throw a few of these in there if you end up not using them. And you're going to be just fine. There we go. I think that's a good good amount of these. I'm going to have to do a later video that's just about how to secure pieces together, and I'll actually show the process that I use. But the basics of it is I have a pair of wire cutters and some like little white painting finishing nails or any other kind of nail. You cut the head off of it, and then you just kind of put that in the hole, and then the two pieces will just slide together and kind of lock in place when you glue them together. All right. Now that we have all these, we need to slice them out just like that. Doing Control minus pad, this activates the bool tool function. If you miss one, it's pretty easy to go back and fix it. I'm going to name this really quickly so I can easily tell which ones I've... finishing nail holes. A lot of people, when they make stuff for 3D printing, they don't like to add additional hardware, like support rods or PVC connectors and things like that. But I just find it just really makes your piece a lot more durable and doesn't add that much complexity to it. It's just, everything just works better when you do it that way. All right, well, save it. Now let's start moving things over to the ready for print folder. So I'm going to duplicate all of these, Control D. Then I'm going to do Command Alt C while I still have those selected, which converts all of those to a mesh. That applies all the modifiers. Move them to ready for print, like so. And let's pop over the ready for prints piece here. There we go. Looks like we have a duplicate of these finishing nails, so I'll just delete those. All right. Now we can start arranging these pieces around. As you can see, we have the holes right there. Those are going to print in our final piece. Another thing you can actually do is have some kind of, you can actually add text and then cut text out of these, so you kind of know how to line them up correctly. But on the flip side, these holes will actually kind of help you. You can actually just put like 3 on one side and 2 on the other. You can make it a little bit simpler to kind of organize how all your pieces are arranged. Although I've had my kit the way it is for a while, and no one's really complained about the about this aspect of it. So I'm flipping these upside down because I want them to be able to print like that. All right, there we are. Looks pretty good. Oops. I need to do the same thing here. Select those. If I select it, you see it has modifiers. I can do apply if I want to. Or I can do Alt-C and convert to a mesh. So they're both totally fine processes to do. When you arrange things for 3D printing, you always want the part of it with the essentially the most surface area to be on the bottom, because you especially want to minimize the amount of support material that you're going to be needing. Or I can do an array here. So you have to print 2 of these at the same time. You can do like a little array or not. Sometimes I'll do some preparation for people who are going to be 3D printing it. Since I know people will be printing it on a 200 by 200 printer like this, I'll just like pre-rotate it for them so that people, when they import it, it'll already be imported at the correct size. They don't have to like worry about that much. So I'll create like a little dummy plane like this just to have an idea about how to arrange the parts. Same thing with this. I can kind of go, oh, that looks like it's about right, and rotate it. That's how I know the part should work on most printers. Be a pretty snug fit, but that should be okay. Those look all right. That's all right. That one should be rotated. This one's like right at the edge there, but that's all right. That'll be fine. In my kits, I very often have had to go back and essentially redo pieces if people have trouble with it. It's like I'll get something done a certain way and realize I messed something up. So then I gotta go back and redo it. Control D to duplicate, M to move to ready for print. Hide those model parts again. Here's a little trick you can do. If you go up to this setting right here, this is the pivot point. You go to individual origins, then hit R to rotate. You can rotate all these at the same time. After I can mesh. So then you rotate them all at the same time. So they'll all just kind of pop right in place like that. And we'll export all these as one big huge part as opposed to multiple smaller ones. So we'll arrange them like so. You can export these as individuals, like just one at a time. Sometimes that's easier, but if you want to do them all at the same time, you have to make sure that they all kind of line up on the same plane, like so. Because they'll be exported as a single object as opposed to multiple tiny ones. And you don't want the printer to have to, the slicer software to suddenly decide that it has to add a bunch of support material that it doesn't need to add. All right, there we go. There are all the pieces for a silent staff. That's it. That's all it takes. So the final part of this process is going to be exporting all of these pieces. And to do that, I'll just start with like the tip point here. Then go to File, make sure you have that one, just that one piece you selected. File, export STL. Then you can name it however you want. I'm going to call this Blade Top Part 1. Ignore that folder there. Then make sure you have selection only selected. And if you're using a scene unit as opposed to just default to blank units, you want to make sure that's selected. But since I'm not, I'm leaving it unselected. But make sure that selection only is clicked, otherwise it exports every single object in the entire collection out as one big huge thing, and it takes forever. Then you hit export STL, and that's it. You've exported that. You just go to the next one, part 2. Export STL, and so forth. Nice and simple. Then you repeat that process for all the different pieces. The final thing I'll often do, especially if I'm creating files for my store, is I will then load these files into a slicer software and see if they slice correctly and see if there's any glitches or mistakes that pop up. Hopefully not too many of those things don't happen. I already see a little mistake right here, but that's okay. So any kind of things that pop up, I'll know immediately, oh, that's a mistake, but I can go back and fix it later on. But that's it. That's the process for creating a Sailor Silence Glaive. I hope this was informative. If you have any questions, comments, or anything, let me know, and I'll try to get back to you.